afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to today's dialogue. My name is Yandisa Jubase, and I will be your facilitator for today. Thank you so much for joining us, and it's going to be an exciting one. Today's dialogue is titled, of course, African Feminism as a Decolonizing Force. So we have a very interesting panel or interesting group of speakers that's going to be helping us unpack such an interesting topic, and we are just going to have space to engage, to hear their thoughts, and just
recording in progress.
Sorry about that. And we are going to have a moment to just, of course, have a Q&A after all the speakers have presented, and then we will engage from there. So for now, I'm going to ask Posetu Sanji to welcome us and to tell us what this dialogue is about and who is hosting us and so forth. So Setu, over to you.
Thank you so much, Yandisa. So colleagues, friends, students, friends of CANRAD and CAS, community members, and everyone who's joining us here today, Molweni, igama lam ndingu Siphosethu Sandi, and today I'm given the task to welcome everyone here on behalf of the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. This is the second dialogue or youth dialogue basically that's happening with CANRAD and CAS. We've been in partnership with, we've been in this partnership since 2015. So today is the last day of Women's Month, and we thought it would be good to close it off with an all-women panel with the topic African Feminism as a Decolonizing Force. Tawanda Sakiyonke was quoted in an article which read, "The issue of African feminism is of great importance to the African woman, not only with regards to their identities, but also as it relates to the issues that affect them in their role in the feminist movement. The assumption, however, that there's one simple African feminism is problematic and necessitates a precise definition. But African feminism is not a clear-cut concept that can be precisely defined or delineated. African feminism that thus addresses cultural issues that pertain to the complex experiences faced by all women of all cultures on the African continent. It put emphasis on Africa and their multifaceted descriptions of women in the continent, sometimes as inert and voiceless victims in comparison to the illustration of Western females as modern, educated, and empowered. African feminists are committed to two struggles: the fight for the empowerment for African women and the fight for decolonizing African societies. With that said, I would like to welcome our facilitator, Ms. Yandisa Jubase, our speakers, Ms. Qhama Noveve, Dr. Hlengi Wendlovu, and Gogo Londiwe Mtambo. Unfortunately, Ms. Ayanda Tito could not join us today due to personal matters, but I look forward to what I believe will be a fruitful and a robust engagement. Ndithi ndicela nikhulule ibhatyi and engage. Thank you. Over to you, Yandisa.
Thank you, Setu. Thank you so much for such a warm welcome, and I'm sure everyone is feeling welcomed and excited to be able to have a conversation, particularly on the last day of what is termed Women's Month in our country. So we're not going to waste any time. We're going to get right into it. And we are going to have our first speaker for today, which is Qhama Noveve. Qhama Noveve is a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and a researcher in the Center for Women and Gender Studies at Nelson Mandela University. Her research interests are in critical higher education studies, gender studies, and African feminism. So I just want to say a disclaimer that Qhama is feeling a little bit fluish, so please be patient with her as she presents, but we are going to have a great time. So Qhama, over to you. Are you ready?
Yes, Yanisa, thank you so much. Thank you to CANRAD for the invitation. So my presentation is titled Towards a Critical Decolonial Feminist Approach to...
send you this email.
a decolonial feminist approach to gender transformation and social justice in higher education. So I'm going to frame the discussion, or rather the presentation, within the domain of African women in higher education. It's not too far-fetched to think that a decolonial feminist theory of liberation is an appropriate intervention, really, to restore the humaneness of gendered others as a branch of a critical intellectual tradition to gender transformation and social justice. So, taken from the work of one of Nelson Mandela University's honorary doctorate recipients, Ben Okri writes in his book Astonishing the Gods back in 1995, he says, the universities were places for self-perfection, places for the highest education in life. Everyone taught everyone else. All were teachers, all were students. The sages listened more than they talked. And when they talked, it was to ask questions that would engage endless generations in profound and perpetual discovery. The universities and the academies were also places where people sat and mediated and absorbed knowledge from the silence. The research was a permanent activity, and all were researchers and appliers of fruits of research. The purpose was to discover the hidden, unified law of things, to deepen the spirit, to make more profound the sensitivities of the individual to the universe, and to become more creative. So Ben Okri's beautifully lyrical vision of the university highlights elements of lifelong collective learning and the importance of listening, the importance of silence and mediation as forms of learning, the connection of intellectual and spiritual labor to creativity and the process of research and knowledge acquisition as the discovery of the principles and values of human existence in the context of a larger global environment. In the context of the academy of the late 20th and early 21st century, however, Okri's description of the purpose and the pedagogy of university life seems to be rather impossibly utopian. Nonetheless, I begin with this vision of the university community precisely because it is utopian and draws attention to the visionary aspects of the work of many teachers and scholars in academic settings around the world. It is also this vision of ethical pedagogy and true knowledge seeking in part that compels me to speak and in my work to continue to write about the increasingly corporate academy and its resistant, oppressive colonial cultures and its profound significance for the feminist struggle. In the introduction to the edited text, Decolonizing the Academy, African Diaspora Studies, Carol Boyce Davies writes, it is intended that the Academy is perhaps the most colonized space. By this I mean it is a site for production and reproduction of a variety of discourses which keep in place certain colonial structures which have as their intent the maintenance of Euro-American hegemonies at the level of thinking and therefore in the larger material world. The various disciplines have functioned as sites for the legitimization of Eurocentric knowledge and are often key locations for the creation and transmission of state ideologies. And indeed, the very philosophical basis on which the academy rests is one which functions to privilege knowledge emanating from European thinkers to legitimate European belief systems, histories, ideologies, principles, and literatures. So, as a Black woman, I am completely aware of how the foundation of particularly the South African intellectual culture is fraught with racist and sexist assumptions that preclude Black women from the life of the mind. As such, I am much more invested in the reading of the university that constructs me as incapable of producing knowledge than in retelling its history. In fact, Lisa Lowe says the operations that pronounce colonial divisions of humanity, which include the academy as an imbricated process, not sequential events, it's ongoing and continuous in our contemporary moment, not temporarily distinct now as yet concluded. So my thesis and argument dive into reading and reading practices, processes, and ideologies to destabilize a system that drives meritocracy to add a contribution to the debates around belonging and inclusion in the real sense of the word. This reading practice means that we need to look beyond the obvious and to mine and excavate historical connections and thus reconstruct knowledge which connects racist and sexist specializing acts to present seeming benevolence of the university, to bring to the fore how new iterations of dominant geographies within the academy operate. Like Sylvia Winter, I'm not interested simply in conveying ideas about the university, but instead I'm more interested in the difficult labor of thinking and thinking anew and thinking towards an African feminist imagination of the human. Searching the critical work of post-colonial critics, I found much writing that documents the continued fascination with the way white minds, particularly the colonial imperialist traveler, perceive Blackness and how very little interest is expressed in representations of whiteness in the Black imagination. Black cultural and social critics allude to such representations in their writing, yet only a few have dared to make explicit those perceptions of whiteness that they think will discomfort or antagonize readers. Chandra Talpade Mohanty, who is a third world feminist academic and writer, says that the concept of being at home does not necessarily constitute a comfortable, stable, inherited, and familiar space, but instead it is an imaginative, politically charged space in which familiarity and sense of affection and commitment lay in shared collective analysis of social justice, as well as the vision of radical transformation. That is defined by so Mohanty means that this definition and conceptualization of the home draws on experience, identity, and a political perspective, and interrupts the notions of home as an all-encompassing space, which is predicated by various exclusions, contestations, and intersections of experience, identity, and political perspectives. That is why Uma Narayan argues that women are not the only people who still view the home as an oppressive space, as a space of oppression, but most importantly, this helps us to rethink of what a home is in different cultural contexts. One that does not force and demand conformity, but that will help us to seek alternatives of defining cultural loyalty and respect in ways that do not come at the expense of women. My thinking about representations of whiteness in the Black imagination has been stimulated by the last 2.5 years of writing my PhD and how the absence of recognition is a strategy that facilitates making a group the other. Imagine then femininity and queer others in the masculine and patriarchal imagination. Being the first Black woman to be a vice chancellor, a head of department, a director of school, the gaze that accompanies you as you walk through the university corridors because you are not the somatic norm. Ideas of home and welcoming spaces assume a sense of comfort and often nostalgia, yet the idea of home itself is very much contested. Bell Hooks, writing on belonging, argues that usually whiteness and patriarchy's response is with naive amazement that Black women critically assess whiteness and patriarchal dominance from a standpoint where whiteness and patriarchy is the privileged signifier. Their amazement that Black women watch white people with a critical ethnographic gaze is itself an expression of racism and sexism. Often their rage erupts because they believe that all ways of looking that highlight difference subvert the liberal belief in a universal subjectivity that they think will make racism or sexism disappear. Analyzing these prejudicial university practices through a reading practice that I mentioned earlier then helps to unearth the various marginalized identity positions occupied by those who, through colonial knowledge production used to justify their oppression and exclusion, are contemporarily constructed as different, even while the institution's relatively newfound diversity and transformation initiatives simultaneously tout their inclusion based on that very same construction. There are a number of South African feminists who've written about the climates and institutional cultures of the academy, and what's common about them is that they've written about the academy as a site of struggle, and this provides us with evidence that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Important to my reading practice is demonstrating the direct connection between colonization and the creation and circulation of European knowledges from which the university directly benefits. Recognizing this connection and shifting away from European knowledges is important to the types of methods we create for understanding the problematics of race and gender today that are not just an extension of intersectionality or include another form of difference. In other words, we need to understand in what Jackie Alexander writes about and refers to as the university's regressive internal politics, and how these politics are predicated on its outward-facing free market liberal ideology and ideas of meritocracy, and the ways in which these combine to impact how those experiencing the university today experience feelings of desire, disappointments, and pleasures based on the ways in which they have historically been included or excluded. As such, according to Angela Davis, for most of our history, the very category of being a human has not embraced Black people. Its abstractness has been colored white and gendered male. As such, to be considered outside of the realm of being human is to be classified as without reason and therefore incapable of self-determination. In her work on the genre of human, Black feminist philosopher Sylvia Wynter writes about a chain of being that represents degrees of rationality among people and civilizations. A chain which the West created and upon it placed themselves at the top and Black civilization and its people at the bottom. It is through this academic, while the consequences of this have varied, what often goes untheorized regarding the impacts of such classification are the affective consequences, so the realm of feeling and emotion. For example, we can imagine the impacts of the early scientific constructions that produce certain ways of thinking and feeling for those constructed as ugly and degenerate. Although according to Catherine McKittrick, science socially produced the human, it is also the epistemological grounds through which racial and sexual essentialism is registered and lived. These research foci and their accompanying themes, for the most part, tended to underscore the long-standing prominence of scientific facts developed between the 18th and the 19th centuries. It is through this academically and scientifically manufactured knowledge that racial and sexual difference came to also stand in for social and cultural markers of difference globally. What we learn from what I've already said is that the bodily abstraction for measurement and quantification through the hegemonic knowledge production renders it, which is the body, legible as a sign of something else and not in itself. This process in turn sets up normalizing frames through which we look at society and those within it either as normal or not, making it more impossible to see, think, and act outside of these frames. Today, educational organizations generate categories, allocate status, and influence group boundaries, and the logic of these boundaries and status and merit are deeply contested and activated to serve particular organizational interests. To be placed outside of the construct of what it means to be a human and to possess human personhood was not only to be constructed by others, but to have the spaces of knowledge construction made unavailable to you. To recognize the overwhelming ways in which the social construction of race and gender has been produced and reproduced in academic disciplines is to realize how any work by the academy to improve itself must engage critically with its colonial foundations. As decolonial scholars who work currently within these institutions and recognize that decolonization is always an unfinished project, we also must critically engage with this past if we envision a more just system, one which recognizes other indigenously produced knowledges. So, to conclude, my vision of democratic citizenship and creating a home for all in higher education would not just entail working to create a space for free scholarly inquiry and exchange in a non-repressive environment. It would also entail the just and equal participation of all groups within the institution. This just and equal participation is necessary for everyone to develop their capacities and exercise their choices. Therefore, attentiveness to gender, race, class, and sexual violence and accompanying inequalities in theorizing democratic citizenship is of utmost importance. Ben Okri's vision that I started out with earlier, this idea of democratic citizenship in higher education is fundamentally opposed to the ideas and values entrepreneurial university, which is our current context and scenario. Clarifying this contradiction in the vision and mission of the university then opens up some unexpected spaces for an anti-racist and a decolonial and a true African feminist engagement. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you so much, Kama. Thank you for such a thought-provoking and, such a rich engagement that you, or rather presentation that you gave to us today. I think what I took out of it is when you say decolonization is always an unfinished project, which makes it ongoing. It makes it not stagnant, but it is something that we'll always be working towards. So thank you so much for that. And we are so happy that you were able to share your thoughts with us. Colleagues, I did write in the chat that you are welcome to share your thoughts as you think of them. At the end, of course, once the speakers are finished with their presentations, we will read some of them or give opportunity to maybe one or two people to ask their questions verbally. But for now, we're going to call our next speaker, which is Ukoko Londi. She said, I must put a disclaimer and say that she must, and assure everyone that she's not driving, she's just sitting in the car because she's at a workshop, but she needed just a quiet space to be able to speak to us today. So, Londiwe is a strategist at Iloa Consultancy, a social justice and sustainable development consultancy. She's an African feminist thinker who specializes on feminist theory, African girlhood, and womanhood. Londiwe holds a master's degree from the Department of Political and International Studies, Rhodes University. Her thesis seeks to expand understandings of the ways in which girlhood and womanhood are experienced in post-apartheid South Africa. Furthermore, she works as a project manager at the Rivonia Circle, focusing on democracy, civic participation, and building communities. Londiwe is a former member of the Commonwealth Youth Forum and Task Force, and tasked with the delivering of CYF that formed part of the discussion of international policy, making the Commonwealth heads of government meeting, which creates a common policies that deal with some of the global issues. Anyway, thank you, Gogolondi. Over to you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Yandisa. Action. I hope that everyone can hear me clearly. And this is Lalin Mtata. I'm doing a workshop here today, so that's where I am. So as introduced, my name is Gogo Londiwe, ngowaka Mtambi Sibongo, as I've been introduced. So I'm glad that I come right after Kama's presentation, which specifically speaks about the corporate academy, because I'm going to structure my presentation in sort of two sections. One is I'm going to give a bit of background and talk a little bit about the way that I decided to do my master's and was able to do my master's, and the kind of work that we were then able to produce because of that kind of methodology. And that directly speaks to the ways in which we think about and that we theorize about African societies, and hopefully you'll be able to see the link between the way in which we think about African societies and the ways in which we then think about decolonization, and why a shift in the way that in the lens and the way that we think about our societies is important. And then the second part is to maybe speak to some questions around some of the findings in my thesis around who the cultural gatekeepers are, and so who are the people who have power to reconstruct and construct our societies. And I'll sort of go through what some of my findings were in my thesis. So the first thing to talk about is when we think about African feminism and when we think about decolonization, for me, is a conversation around, so when we think about African feminism, we cannot divorce that from decolonization, right? Because fundamentally, for me, I think feminism is about my ability to be free. Ukwenza into engifisa ukuyenza ngempilo yami, right? And feminism, and particularly African feminism, in my context, is the way that I choose to think about my life and the way that I choose to think about society. And it's the thing that I think gives us an emancipatory sort of society and platform, right? And so my understanding is that decolonization is an emancipatory project, right? It's about obani abakhona ukukhululeka ukuze baphile impilo yabo ngendlela ekufanele bayiphile ngayo, but also live at a certain standard of life. And so for me, when I did my MA, and I've been using this platform and this conversation, this presentation in particular, to reflect on my time doing my MA, I think I was clear about a few things. I was clear that I wanted to do a master's that reflected the people that I was that were my participants in terms of fieldwork. I was doing a master's that was about Umemulo, that was about Zulu women, that was about Zulu girls. And so I wanted those people to be able to read that master's, or to be able to pick it up on any level and be able to see themselves reflected in that paper, or in that thesis. And I think that that's particularly important, that the work that we do in the academy and the ways in which we think about the work that we do, particularly when we do work that that is also reflective of ourselves, that we are able to reflect ourselves and reflect other people who form that category of persons, in different ways, right? Because you're not going to be able to create a homogeneous Zulu girlhood or a homogeneous Zulu womanhood. That's just not how identities work in general, right? And the second thing that I wanted with my master's is that I wanted it to be, what's the word? Ifundeke man, like ingabi so academic that you cannot have access to it. I wanted it to be really, really accessible in terms of the kind of language and the ways in which we put the project together. And I think for me, it's really, really important for us, if we want to step away from what Ukama so eloquently described with this corporate academy, is to move away from the frills of it all, right? And to think about our work, whether we're talking about decolonization or we're talking about democratization or we're talking about other parts of our societies, but to think about our work in ways that everyone can think about that work, in ways that are accessible for people to think about their communities. And I think that this is particularly important if we're going to use African feminism as a lens or as a tool within which we do decolonization, right? And so when we think about the lens in which we do decolonization, it's important ukuthi sikwazi ukukhuluma ngayo in languages that we understand and in ways and in practical ways that we all understand. I always find it very interesting reading, particularly decolonial philosophy, where it's so completely abstract and wordy and certain really big words that as a Black person and as an African person, I'm like, what is the conversation that we're actually having? And I think that it's important then to do our work in such a way where we consider our positionality in the work. Your positionality is important as part of that community. I'm not saying that we need to center ourselves in the work, but I'm saying that we need to acknowledge our positionality and use our positionality in order for us to be able to think about the ways in which we structure societies better. For me, the Decolonial project is about how do we think about power? How do we think about the ways in which our societies are structured, and how do we reimagine that? How do we rethink that? And so part of the things that I found in my findings is that it was clear to me that in a conversation about the Zulu culture, and particularly umemulo and the transition between girlhood and womanhood, that the cultural gatekeepers were women themselves, right? That the kind of then transition one has from girlhood to womanhood is determined by other women, right? And so if the cultural gatekeepers are patriarchal and follow a kind of anti-women and anti-feminist kind of rhetoric, then you have a transition that is patriarchal, that is anti-women, that is anti-feminist, right? But if you have women who may not necessarily call themselves feminists, or who may not necessarily call themselves anything really, but women who are in senior positions within our communities that then help girls transition from girlhood into womanhood, if those women themselves are thinking about society in more progressive ways, then you have a more progressive transition. And so what we found is that as the society shifts, and as and when the needs of the family and of the community shift, so when we need more industrious women, or we need more women to be participating in the economy and going to university and sort of moving, sort of having upward mobility, the requirements around how and who transitions from girlhood into womanhood also then include those factors. And so when we were talking about transitioning from girlhood to womanhood maybe 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, maybe we wouldn't have spoken about the need for women to be independent. Whereas right now, we speak about the need for women to be independent. And that is part of the requirements or part of the factors that then allow us to see Uguti who is able to transition from this girlhood into this womanhood, right? And please remember, I'm specifically talking about uh, Zulu girlhood, and specifically talking about the process of transitioning through umemu, right? And so for me, I think it's important that we think about, when we think about decolonization and we think about the ways in which we want to restructure our societies, that it's important for us to identify who are the people who have the power in our communities and how can we use those people in order to make those shifts. It is also it was clear in this particular research that the cultural gatekeepers and the people who had the power in the situation were more than willing to shift the boundaries and the barriers of culture and the understandings of what it is to be a woman and what it is to be what it is to be a woman, in order for the understanding to be more progressive. In one of the communities that I looked at in the Sambaru culture in Kenya, part of the thing that they struggled with when they were doing a campaign against female genital mutilation, part of the things that they struggled with is that the elder women who were the cultural gatekeepers in that scenario didn't buy into the sort of alternatives and the reforms that the younger women had bought into. And so it was important then to think about how we bring, or how they bring the elder women in that community into the conversation in a way that then allows for a shift in culture, a shift in the ways that we as a society. And so for me, decolonization then is about shifting that thing. Ukuthi siphila kanjani mina nawe, or siphila kanjani as a society, and how do we then shift the conversation of hierarchies, and how do we shift the existence of hierarchies? And my argument here isn't about the oppressed going to teach the oppressor. No, that's not my argument. My argument here is that collectively, when we think about decolonization and when we think about the different tools that we can use to decolonize our societies, we have to do so collectively, and we have to acknowledge that there are already systems and structures that are in place that need to be engaged, right? And so operating outside of those, operating without engaging those, isn't always necessarily helpful. In my work now as a democracy, as a person who does work in democracy, and democracy building, I guess, what we found is that the solutions exist within the communities, right? For whatever challenges that they are facing. Of course, they might need more capacitating. Of course, they might need a better platform. Of course, they might need other resources, but the solutions exist within that society. And so when we think about our own societies and our own families and our own communities, we have to be able to then think about decolonization in that space. Ukuthi uma, ugogo, ubaba ucabangani mayecabanga about decolonization, because the people who are going to decolonize our societies is us. The people who are going to democratize our societies, it's us, right? And I don't think that it's like this external thing that comes from above, you know. And so fundamentally, my questions and the thing that I'm preoccupied with is who do we engage, or how do we engage power in order to start to shift the ways in which we think about our societies, the ways in which we study our societies, and the ways in which we construct our societies. And I think I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Coco. Thank you so much for your provocations and your thoughts. and your questions. I think that was quite a mouthful in terms of, it was reflective, it was thought-provoking, and I think there's a lot of provocations that are there, and maybe just asking ourselves some of the questions as to, if we're talking about decolonization, but taking it home, taking it to our own families, how do we make sense of it in our own context and in our own communities? And I think that's such a valuable conversation to have. Anyway, now we're going to have our last speaker, Dr. Hlengiwe. Just a second, colleagues, I'm looking for the bio. Dr. Hlengiwe. Dr. Hlengiwe is a senior lecturer at the Wits School of Governance, University of Witwatersrand. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Witwatersrand. Before joining WSG, Hlengiwe was a senior lecturer at the University of Free State, where she lectured in the Department of Sociology. Previously, Hlengiwe completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for Women and Gender Studies at Nelson Mandela University. She then joined the Center for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg, initially as a postdoctoral fellow, then as a research associate, where she is one of the principal investigators working on a collaborative research project on democracy from below. Hlengiwe has lectured at the University of the Western Cape's Department of Sociology and Anthropology, Sociology Department at the University of Witwatersrand, and Hlengiwe's PhD thesis grappled with state and society relations, questions of gender representation in the local state, and the everyday reproduction of the urban space as a form of democratic citizenship. Her research and publications are concerned with three areas: gender, equality, democracy from below, and social movements and collective actions and change. Among other publications, Hlengiwe has written on the role of women in the hashtag Fees Must Fall movement, histories of participation of women in community protests, and the precarity of women during the COVID-19 pandemic. She is also the co-editor of Writing Diaries of Wits for List 2017. Outside of the academic space, Hlengiwe is a board member of the Soul City Institute, where she also sits on the Auditing, Finance, and Risk Committee. As part of her academic citizenship, she facilitates an online module in gender relations and women emancipation for members of parliament at the OR Tambo School of Leadership. Yes. So, Dr. Hlengiwe, welcome, and yes, your bio speaks for yourself.
Thank you so much, Yandisa. That was very generous of you reading all that long bio. I'm very honored with the invitation to participate in today's seminar, but also most importantly, speaking after Ugogulondi Nokama. Their work is very provocative, very important. Especially when we reflect on questions of feminism, but also, so I'm having a bit of a network hitch. With your permission, Yandisa, can I switch off my video? Okay, thank you so much for that. So the work that I'm presenting today is part of my ongoing project that I'm currently working on, mostly with Mama Manano. So the presentation is titled Degendering Protests and Recasting Women Mobilized under the Identity of Mama Manano at the Picket Line. So the work that I'm trying to do here is to bring the role of the women, the role of Omama Manano in community struggles, but most importantly, not just as actors who are coming to the space, but also as actors with agency who reproduce their everyday urban space in the everyday in ways that are relevant to their everyday struggles. So my work brings some bit of a historical perspective from the work that I'm doing. I'm just drawing from 2 case studies. The one from the Bantu Square massacre of 1952 and the Duncan Village massacre of 1985. And common to these 2 protests was the centrality of the role of Omama Manano and in organizing, mobilizing, but also strategizing around these protests. So the story of the Black Sunday in particular has been and continues to be told and written in ways that I believe contribute to gender inequalities that are qualified through erasure and silencing the role of Black women from these struggles, from historical struggles. So part of this project that I'm doing is a contribution to the project of reviving the memory of Black Sunday by rewriting the history and centering the voices and contribution of Black women and these township struggles in general. So one of the observations that I had while collecting data for this work was that the story of Sister Aiden, as I've already said, continues to be told in ways that erase the women. So the voices and the role of women now that I hope to center at the community struggles and at the forefront of the protest of the Eastern Cape province through this retelling of the story of Sister Aiden were affected by the Bantu Square massacre in Duncan Village, either as participants in the protest, as mothers, as wives, daughters, girlfriends, among other relationships. But most importantly, many of them identify as Omama Manano, as consciously mobilized under this identity as the legitimate and authoritative voice of reason for that particular time, given that most of the political parties, political leaders had been banished. So around 1952, with the Defiance Campaign, there was no much of activism outside of the normal political spaces, but the church and the home therefore became that space for political activism. So in doing this work, I problematize the retelling of the history of the Black Sunday. As I've already said, that it is centered on the narratives of the death of Sister Aiden that I'll say a little bit later in terms of who she was. But also this story has been told in ways that that has silenced the death of more than 200 Black lives, of which the majority, again, were women and Omama Manano in particular. So in unearthing this history and retelling, the story of Black Sunday is important, particularly in working against the histories of silencing and histories of erasure of women's participation in community struggles broadly. So the work draws from archival work, but also from the life histories of women that I exposed to during my ethnographic mapping of Buffalo City and East London between 2014 and 2020. And some of the methodologies that I had to deploy, one of them is the Black African feminist thought, intersectional feminism, and fragmented narrative. And those were important because I'm dealing with different perspectives and different versions of feminisms that are not necessarily that popular in our everyday discourse, especially looking at the women of church, also bringing the womanist approach into the conversation, but also fragmented narrative was key in terms of the recollection of the memories of the stories that were shared, but also paying attention to the histories of erasure on one hand, but also textual violence, to say that as we try to navigate textual violence, we also sometimes fall into the trap of, so in remembering these, collecting these different stories, we also fall into the trap of dismembering the same women that we're trying to remember the stories, who are in their everyday experiences constantly dismembered, whether figuratively or physically, since we know, the extent of gender-based violence and femicide in this country, but also different forms of violence that women experienced, especially in the scholarship, not only of the Global South, but mainly, the shutting down of the archive and our constantly moving back to the archive to try and resurrect these voices. So this work in particular explores the agency of women as strategists and organizers in community struggles that tend to raise their presence from the front line and only present them as mothers, focusing on care work, or as victims of these protests through rape and other forms of violence. So I explore experiences of Women of Manano as actors with agents who are capable of reproducing their urban space in ways that make sense to them and their everyday lived experiences. And here I bring Tsing's work to the conversation, and I quote, she argues that by treating women and men as individual commentators in their culture, we ask about disruptive as well as unifying features of their perspectives without assuming gender, ethnic, or political homogeneities. So thus, in reading these stories, these narratives, empathy and sensitivity therefore becomes a thread that runs through reading and understanding the experiences of women as they assert their presence in collective community struggles and protests of the Eastern Cape. So I've already said that the story of the Black Sunday is problematic because it has centered the voice and the death of Sister Aiden. But also the aim here is not to amplify the story of Sister Aiden again, but also not to erase her, and most importantly, her important work that she did in Duncan Village. But the aim is not to center or decenter, but is to recenter her, Sister Aiden, and locate her death within a context of the historical events of that time, thereby, recentering the events of the Black Sunday and locating it at Bantu Square, where the tragedy can be traced to. That work promises not only to acknowledge more than 200 lives of Black people lost, but also to resurrect the women of Manano who are hardly mentioned in written histories, yet they were main victims of that day. Also is to acknowledge the significance and the complexities of the Defiance Campaign and the role of the ANC Youth League in the Eastern Cape in that particular time around 1952, where major political parties were banished. So who was Sister Aiden that I keep on bringing here? So she was born on the 3rd of December in 1914 in Ireland, and after completing her university studies at University College Cork in 1933, she joined the Dominican Sisters at St. Catherine in England. She arrived in King Williamstown in South Africa on the 16th of April 1938, and then in 1940, along with her colleagues, Sister Mary Amanda, she was sent to study medicine at the University of the Witwatersrand. She started a medical career at Glencrye Hospital and established a clinic at St. Peter Clever in Duncan Village in 1949, where she worked until she met her death on the 9th of November, 1952. So while the story of Sister Aiden remains of great interest in apartheid and post-1994 narrative, it is also retold in problematic gendered narratives that expose the intersections of her race, gender, culture, and religion. The isolation of the story of the tragic death of Sister Aiden from historical context in which it occurred exposes her, I argue, to sexist constructions of her identity that reduce her work and profession to that of a caring mother who was killed because she cared a lot as a woman. So I argue that in the existing narratives, the intersection of Sister Aiden's culture and religion and her gender already place her in a vulnerable position, both physically and symbolically. In one of short biographies that was written by Father Bernard Delane, tells us about her devotion to her career and religious duties. It is only in death that Sister Aiden's work can finally be recognized and acknowledged like superior male figures in the Bible. Here I quote, Dylan writes that in encountering her killers, she was stoned with St. Stephen. In her death was with St. Paul, and all those who died with the sword. And in her burning, she is reunited with St. Lawrence. So despite the devotion of Catholic culture and religion to St. Mary the Virgin, there is no association of Sister Aiden with her throughout the biography. So Sister Aiden's career and work seem to have put her in danger in terms of the extent to which she opened herself to the Duncan village community, with an assumption that there should have been a superior father advising her and guiding her. So Delaney puts it, and I quote, her work and the confidence the superiors placed in her gave her freedom of action that is exceptional in normal life of a nun. So this is to say, if Sister Aiden had lived the normal life of a typical nun, the chances of her being caught up in the events of the Black Sunday would have been minimized. So in this story, so the death of Sister Aiden occurs in a broader and complex political situation where the youth leaders called a meeting at a place called Bantu Square in a Duncan Village township. And this was meant to be a political gathering, but because of the Gatherings Act that prohibited people from gathering that time, the meeting was then paused as a prayer meeting. So what happened, a few minutes into the meeting, the police came and they started shooting. And Sister Aiden, then being the medical doctor there, was running, coming from town, probably coming to serve people. And what then happened is that she then met with the angry crowd because the police were already shooting using live ammunition. And then she was killed by a mob of Black people. And then her body was mutilated and she was burned beyond recognition. But the headlines, both internationally and locally, maintained that only 6 people died, but never said anything about the 200 people who died along with her. And at the center of these people, or at the center of Bantu Square, so there were hundreds of women of Manano, because the crowd is estimated at 1,500 to 2,000 people. So women were seated on the floor when the police started shooting. So one of the pieces of work that have been produced is a documentary called The Dark Cloud. And from that documentary, the women of Manano and the role of the church in particular, it shows how they've played a crucial role in the histories of Black communities by holding the space both in the spiritual, economic, and political life of the community. At the height of apartheid repression, which saw activists being targeted, arrested, and detained, violence redefined the role of Black women and moved their gender role. And here I quote Ulihle Ngoboz, who writes, beyond the private-public sphere dichotomy, throwing them at the coalface of the struggle and resistance. So in reconfiguring the home as a space of resistance, spaces such as the church, burial societies, and stockpiles transformed into solidarity networks and spaces of collective resistance. So I argue that the home now here as a battlefield for women understood and conceptualized as a space where power dynamics are not a reflection of pure patriarchal domination, but a site of struggle, resistance, and contestation. This is where I locate Omama Manano and their struggles in Duncan Village and other community struggles widely. So moving towards closing, in the documentary that I mentioned earlier, the producer of the documentary called Ukoko Kabe concludes the documentary by stating the importance of this historical event by arguing that if correctly documented in history, the massacre is even larger than the Sharpeville massacre, therefore deserving the same level of recognition. In emphasizing his point, Kabe asked an important question. Kodwa aphi na amathambo amaqhawe angalowo mini, which is to say we've apologized to the Catholic nun, but where are the bones of the heroes from that day? In recollection of these memories and revival of the history of Black Sunday, I insist on that an equally important question should be asked along Kabe's question. Aphi na amagama amaqhawekazi awanikelwa kwimfazwe yaseBantu Square? Where are the voices of women, dead or alive, who were sacrificed at the battlefront of Bantu Square? So while Kabe's question is important for retelling the history of the Bantu Square massacre, I argue that asking the question about the names of the women who were at Bantu Square, whether dead or alive, is an effort to ensure that in correcting this history, it is only fair to recognize and center the role of women and Omama Manano in community struggles and struggles of Duncan Village in particular, as they continue to play this role. So this Omanyano identity, it is a very important identity that women even continue to mobilize, even to date, when they are faced with trouble, but also in their everyday ways of navigating economic hardship and other forms of struggle in communities. And my contribution to the work is to say this work should be recognized, and this identity and the role of Omama Manano should be centered at any community struggles that we begin to talk about. And in that way, we begin to contribute to the broader debate around African feminisms and as a decolonizing force, because African feminisms are diverse and they take different forms, and acknowledging each and every corner of the work that is done. For me, we are beginning to contribute to the project, not only of archiving while these women are still alive, but also of telling the stories from their own perspective. Thank you, Yandisa. I'll leave it here.
Thank you so much, Doc. Thank you so much for such a great and thought-provoking as well input. I think I enjoyed so much your thoughts around erasure, the reality or the value of Omama Manano still being a sense of community for a lot of women still even today. So thank you so much for your input, and thank you for just taking time to share your thoughts with us. Colleagues, we are now going to move towards the Q&A session. I see there are a few comments on the chat section. So I'm going to read them. If there is a particular person who would like to maybe, read out loud their comment, I will allow for the opportunity to do that. And then the speakers then can respond, and then we can take it from there. I see the first one is from Apiwe Bizani. I'm not sure, Apio, would you like to read your question yourself, or should I do that for you? Apio?
Hi. No, it's fine. You can read it.
Thank you. Okay, so up here it says, to all panelists, in dominant legal scholarship, there seems to be a genuine intellectual commitment, curiosity, and integrity to engage feminist legal scholarship, in particular, African feminist legal scholarship, as a worthwhile category in the production of legal scholarship in general. How then can we galvanize African feminism as a decolonizing force to rupture the status quo and herald an epoch of epistemic justice? Yeah. So that's the first question. I think I'll read two and then I'll give opportunity to the speakers to respond, and then I'll read another two and then we can continue. The second one is from Uhleliwe Khumalo. It says, insightful presentation, Gogolondi. It is imperative for us to look at the existing opportunities within our contexts in which we can promote decolonization. We need to be relatable and on the ground level. If we aim to challenge the oppressive structures, doing away with the ISMS that can be intimidating as well, enables others who are not in the academy to join in on these discussions, as this can contradict what we aim to dismantle. Okay, I think that was a comment rather than a question. And then, yes, in terms of, and then, yeah, I think those are the two questions at the moment. And then I will read the rest. I think there's one other one, but let's start with the first one from Apiwe. Yeah, let's deal with the one from Apiwe, and I see there's just another one from Sianda, and then we can do that in the second round. Okay, so I think Kama, I see Kazi, your hand is up. I'll note you for the second round. So Kama, we can respond to Apiwe's question. Yeah.
Thanks, Yandisa. I actually responded on the chat because every time I speak, I I start coughing. So
okay.
Yeah, I think I responded particularly to Apiwe, but just very, very briefly, I think we need to also take into account the legal discipline in itself, the structure of that discipline and the structure of the occupation in itself. I mean, whose interests is it really for? And you'd find that, of course, in the legal fraternity, it's dominated by males. So it's not surprising that then ideas or philosophies like African feminism would be in the periphery because it's challenging that particular power structure. So I made an example here on the chat section about things like sexual harassment. The structure and the ways and the procedures and the rules, the ways in which they are framed, or the ways in which the justice system works, is that it can both victimize and vindicate perpetrators and complainants. And because there's that paradox in even defining or coming to a common understanding of what consent is. So it would not be surprising that the legal fraternity and people in the legal field would find that a philosophy like African feminism would fall on the wayside. But really, it's a missed opportunity because the epistemology in itself, it offers great interventions in terms of how we begin to think about power relations in society. Because usually when the law is applied, it's always focusing on individuals, the individual perpetrator, the relationships between individuals, the perpetrator and the complainant, or sometimes when an employer is involved. But people just forget, or maybe would rather ignore the broader power relations and dynamics that are at play. Because remember, what happens within the justice system or within the legal realm, or for instance, in my domain, higher education, it's a reflection of society. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Kama, for that. Gogolondi, is there something maybe you'd like to add on to that conversation?
So maybe not to that conversation, but I'm seeing the some of the comments and the questions around the ways in which we think about gender binaries as colonial conceptually, and you know the what the need is to link feminism, or rather African feminism, and decoloniality or decolonial scholarship. And I think fundamentally, for me, feminism is not about enforcing binaries. It's never been about that, right? Particularly when we talk about gender binaries. In fact, it's about the opposite. It's about creating inclusive ways of understanding gendered oppressions. And I think even though we can say that gender binaries are colonial, it is clear that the legacy of the oppression of gender based on gender binaries is here, right? We live with it every day. It's why we talk about equal pay. It's why we talk about equal access. It's why we talk about equality for women, right? And not just for women, but also for when it comes to representation, we talk about queer folk, right? Or rather queer communities. So whether or not these oppressions that we're dealing with, if we can agree that all of them are colonial in the most extremist sort of Africanist, I don't know, sense, we have to agree that the legacy of these oppressions are here and are clear, and that trying to think about decolonization in one way without thinking about dealing with gendered oppression is limiting, right? As a form of thinking about decolonization. And then maybe just to say that the work that people like Dr. Hlengiwe do, that Lihle Ngobozi, or Dr. Magadla, all of those women, Amai Dume, the work of Dr. Mtseme, like all that work around memory and around our experiences of whether we're speaking in the apartheid context or we're speaking in the post-apartheid context, all of that work on memory and on our experiences are important for us to think about the ways we recreate and reimagine society. We have to allow ourselves to reimagine society, because the thing that we have right now is not it. And we can agree on that, right? And then maybe lastly, just to say that when we think about African feminism and we use it as a lens to think about, we can use it as a lens to think about economics. We can use it to think about governance, right? We can use it to think about politics. We can use it to think about democracy. And so for me, indlela esiphila ngayo, and nangendlela esicabanga ngayo, ngendlela esiphila ngayo, the African feminist lens for me seems to be the most emancipatory. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Gogo. I think Siwe this was seeking to answer your comment on the comment on the chat section. Dr. Hlengi, would you like to add anything to the conversation about yeah?
Oh yes, thanks, Yandy. And I concur with my colleagues, Ukama and Okokulondi, in terms of how they are responding to this question of decolonizing law as a discipline. So for me, one of the important works around African feminist thoughts is the painful realization, of the odds against, being an African and a feminist at the same time, and some of the assumed, positions within those contexts and settings, but most importantly, the realization that commitment to gender equality and to being a feminist in particular is a painful exercise, but that has to continue happening. We have to continue the fight despite what. So I must say we're all dealing with colonial disciplines. They are all of them Eurocentric. They are backed up by particular structures, some of them that are unmovable, like the judicial system. But it is up to us, like Ugokulondi is saying, what are we doing, about the work? How are we contributing, no matter how small, to the project of decolonization? And I like how Ugokulondi talks about, the role of memory and experience, because I believe that there is no amount of theorization that can supersede lived experience. So even those colonial constructs and those knowledges, no matter how problematic they were drawn from our own personal experiences as the people of the global South. And what are we doing in terms of correcting the narrative and rewriting our own histories? And one of the important works that contributes to my everyday thinking also is the work of Walter Mignolo around epistemic dissonance, but also his thinking around the geopolitical location of knowledge. A recognition that knowledge is geopolitically located in the global north by racially marked bodies who produce, these knowledges. And that's why even in the sociology discipline, we have fathers of sociology, we never have mothers of sociology. But also our duty then as scholars who are coming now to do the work is to make sure that we dislocate the work by moving knowledge and knowledge production from the global north to the global south. We decenter it, but also the focus on the exercise of degendering and demasculinizing, because one of the things that we've done and one of the critiques of the decolonial project or rewriting Africa from an African context is that, again, it has been told through 3 M's, which is Mamdani, Mbembe, and Mutembe. So what are we doing? So we cannot just decolonize knowledge. We cannot just decenter the knowledge. We also need to degender it, by raising those voices of women who have been doing the work and other, non-gender binary bodies, bringing them into the space in terms of collective thinking, but also rethinking our own projects in different folds. So I would say there is a possibility in every discipline. It just needs commitment to doing the work. Cite Black scholars deliberately, cite Black women deliberately, so that at least what are you doing? You're moving, you're expanding the canon of knowledge, you're expanding the knowledge that is out there, and the bodies that are being recognized as producing knowledge. I'll leave it here.
Sure, Dr. Klings, thank you so much for those comments. I think there are some good provocations there. And I like it when you say we don't only need to decolonize and decenter scholarship, but we also need to degender it, which I think is absolutely accurate. I saw a hand from Oscar Dao. Dao, is your hand still up?
Hi, Andisa. I think the panelists did kind of address what I wanted to kind of bring out, but I'll drop in a thought here, if I may.
Yes.
Thank you so much. And I think Dr. Klings, hi, it's so good to see you again, was saying something so interesting now about just linking it with shifting geographies, right? And I think your work, in fact, all 3 of your work, for me, in terms of the decolonial conversation, is using different spaces as areas where knowledge comes from. So I'm thinking particularly about the ways in which Ubabu Mamdambo's work is based in a particular kind of setting where Zulu womanhood and Zulu girlhood is then constructed. Dr. Hlengiwe's work goes into particularly the community, but also the church as a site of space making, right? And then Kama then is thinking about how the institutional culture then changes differently when you have a more sensitized, a gender sensitized and a gender conscious higher education space. And so my thought is around space making and how your work not only is shifting who is the knowledge maker, right? Or who is at the center of the knowledge, but also the location itself. And I think that that's quite interesting that it's coming out for me. I'm not sure if that was something that was intentional within your work. So I'd like for you guys to please comment on that. If the site itself contributes to meaning making, the space as the site of meaning making. So Dr. Thengs talks about the church, that space as the site of intellectual work. Yeah, so that's just a thought. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dao. Okay, so I see a comment. I think I'm just going to read one last one and give the speakers just an opportunity to respond for the last time to the comments. So this one is from Alios S. Baleni. It says, Dr. Thengiwe Ndlovu, what is your view in relation to violence as a resource to mobilize feminist solidarities and also to dismantle gender identities? So that is, yeah, I think, yeah, and then I think the rest is just a thank you very much from Enva. I don't see, yeah, I think that's it. So I'm going to give it back to, okay, Ukama did write something in the chat. I think it's because she's having, challenges with her voice and with her flu. Let me just read it out loud. She says, I think at this particular point, the pressing concern is how we give space to those previously silenced voices as we move from repression to understanding new ways of being. Answering these questions requires the revisiting of those experiences and voices that remain neglected and marginalized. Such is the case of Black women's voices and the ways they have shaped and continue to shape their subjectivities. So what the decolonial feminist force is trying to craft a renewed discourse on women in the South African present. Yeah, in South African present context, maybe. It's not the end, but a start. Yes, so I think I'll give it to Gogo Londi, then Dr. Thengs. Kama, if you do want to say something, just let me know, and then we can do closing remarks as well.
Yeah, thank you so much to everyone for engaging. I mean, I don't have a lot to say. I think what Ukoko was saying, what Ukoko was saying around the sites and meaning is really, really important. And again, it goes back to the ways in which we study and we decide to do our work, right? That we have to prioritize the site and the importance of the people that are in that site, and that what means something to me, it might not mean the same thing kuwe, right? So when we think about womanhood, we think about girlhood, we think about even decolonization, what it means to me may not necessarily be what it means to yourself. And so what are the negotiations that need to happen there in order for us to then reimagine and rethink? And maybe I'll say this just one last time, is that for me, I think it's really, really important for us to rethink and reconstruct and reimagine our societies. Our imagination is probably the best thing, the best tool that we have right now, because we understand that le eskuyo is soup, and that's not where we want to be. And so it's important for us to think about, and to think about it now, right? Before we, as and when we are dismantling, before we are dismantling think about what the thing that we are trying to go to, and the thing that we want to create. I think that that's really, really important as we think about the Decolonial project. Thank you so much for the opportunity, for the platform. It's been a fantastic conversation. I also hear that it's Dr. Hlengiwe's birthday. So for her to be giving us all these insights on her birthday, really, siyabonga kakhulu. Thokozani.
Thokoz. Dr. Clems, happy birthday also. And I think you can, share your comments and your closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Coco, for your happy birthday message, and thank you so much, Yandy. Such a great pleasure. I did say to Usposeto that you are abusing me. It's my birthday that day, but it is lovely to celebrate with all these people with such beautiful conversations. There was a direct question to me about my view in relation to violence as a resource to mobilize feminist solidarities and also dismantle gender identities. A difficult one, a really difficult one. So in my own work, I write about violence, but in relation to women experiences, so I delineate 4 sides of violence, and I theorize them as battlefields where women constantly have to battle with different forms of violence. First of them being the physical body, where women experience violence in their everyday physically, and then the second one being the families or the home, which, while entrusted with the responsibility for socialization, passing values from one generation to another, they are also unfortunately violent spaces, especially for women, as they have to navigate their rapists, but also violent forms of socialization where they are taught about gender roles that are violent in themselves. I also identify communities with the same, because communities are meant to protect us. In their claim to protect, girls are not even allowed to come home late in the evening. But also, who are they afraid of? Who are they running away from if they are not safe? The same people who claim to be protecting them. And then I also theorize the state as another battlefield where women have to battle violence. And here looking at the state institutions broadly that are supposed to be protecting women, like the judicial systems, the police stations, and all these different spaces, but also everyday forms of violence within these spaces. And as a mobilizing force for solidarity, yes, we come together here and there, to protest and all of them and all of that. Doing away with gender, to dismantle gender identities. The thing is, the big problem is that in these movements, when we come together with differing, challenges, we carry different baggages, but the suicide of every movement is the refusal to acknowledge the intersectionalities of the struggles, to simply dismiss the existence, because if at least we're at a position where we at least acknowledge that there are intersections of struggle, intersections of how we experience violence in the everyday. Before we even move to what do we do about it? We don't, and that was the suicidal mission of a movement like Fizz Must Fall as well, just to refuse to acknowledge the differences. So we need to begin with acknowledging differences so that we can build solidarities, because right now we are ceremonial protesters. We are highly, responsive, so reactive. We react to situations, but without doing a lot of work in terms of background work, how we strategize in the everyday so that when the situation comes, where are we at? So that's my take on that. And on yours, Gokus Pagazi, on the space, the space making. So in my own work, I do not call my participants as participants. I refer to them as local historians. And what that means to me is to say, I wouldn't have known the history of Duncan Village and the history of apartheid to the extent, and apartheid violence to the extent that I do now, had the local historians not share, you know, their experiences with me. And my own PhD thesis is written half Xhosa and half English, because I couldn't translate. In fact, I refused to translate interviews that were conducted in isiXhosa, because one of the arguments that I was making is that we've read ourselves on the footnotes for the very longest time, but that's an old argument. But mine was to say the language that the people of Duncan Village chose to engage my own research is the language that they use in the everyday to navigate the world. So I can only make sense of the stories that they're telling me because they're letting me through the window of their lives, of which they navigate in isiXhosa. So I didn't translate those interviews, but also that refusal to translate also is to say, these are the people who shared their stories. If they happen, no one reads, you know, academic, like thesis, the thesis itself, even in the academia itself, people hardly read my thesis. But one day when someone picks up this piece of paper, at least let them recognize themselves, because I was backing, you know, textual violence on the side to say we collect people's stories and then we go publish them in prestigious journals in our own languages in ways that we understand. We even have the authority to select the information from what they give us to, you know, to make arguments. So as a way of saying, okay, these are some of the things. So they are chapters. There's a chapter actually that I co-wrote with the participants, because I wanted them to, first of all, to recognize themselves in the story, but to make sure that as I change the stories for the purpose of anonymity and all of those things, I remained within the confines of the story, because what I learned during that field of time is that consent is not a once-off thing where we give people papers, they sign off their stories, and then you run away with them. But as women, and Black women in particular, sometimes we consent using our agency, but unconsciously consent on behalf of our communities. And it happens with stories of rape. They can give you the story in confidentiality, but when you go, you know, when you write that story, people can recognize themselves in that story, and you can actually be held accountable without your name even appearing there. So me coming into the space to work with these women, as a result, I don't even have interviews. I have conversations ranging from 4 to 8 hours with one person. I call them life histories, because I allowed the people to engage my work in ways that were meaningful to you know, to their own everyday lived experiences, because I felt like we as researchers were so entitled to people's times. We want to come, give us what we want and all of that, and then we leave. So yeah, I'll leave it there. And thank you to the conduct team for organizing such a wonderful event. Yandisa, as usual, on top of your game. Thank you so much, Sisi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Slengs. Okay, Kama, is there anything else quickly as we close that you'd like to say as your closing remarks?
First of all, thank you to Canred for this invitation. I almost didn't honor it because I'm sick, but I'm so happy that I eventually made it. And this was quite a robust good conversation. But just as a parting remark, is that the basis of African feminism and the decolonial feminist movement is that obviously it recognizes the role of colonization in how we understand gender. However, if we are going to move towards a journey where at some point we are going to totally decolonize the ways in which we understand gender, I think the starting point, the point where we are now, which is dismantling this patriarchal dominance, which is at an expense of certain individuals in society, is a starting point, right? There was a comment about binaries, and of course it's true. Gender is a binary, it's a colonial imposition. But for us to move closer to how we dismantle this whole colonial canon is by dismantling patriarchy as its basis, so that we can move towards positive decolonial futures. Because at this particular point, we can never decolonize gender if we leave patriarchy untouched, which is the current focus of the decolonial movement at this particular point. So that's my parting remarks. Thanks, colleagues.
Thank you so much, Kama, and thank you for really pushing through. I really do hope that you get better soon. Colleagues and friends, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much for engaging with us. Thank you to the speakers, and just thank you for showing up. The next series, or the next dialogue, will of course be announced, and look out on your emails, look out on your social media, on both the CAS and CanRed pages. Setu, if there's nothing else, I do think we have come to the end of today's dialogue.
I think Sianda would be doing the closing remarks.
Okay, Sianda, over to you.
Hello, greetings everyone. Am I audible, Yandisa?
Yes, sir, you are.
All right, thank you very much. Greetings everyone. Greetings to our panelists. Greetings to you, Yandisa Chubase. Greetings to our audience, our colleagues at CAS and CanRad. Mine is to say thank you to everyone who have attended this remarkable session. And I would like to also thank again our speakers for the fruitful and rich engagement. This was really one of the best engagements that we have had at CAS and CanRad. So I would like for you guys to also support us in our next dialogue, and we would really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sianda, and thank you for bidding us farewell in such a great way. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see each other in the next dialogue that you will see soon on your memo. And have a lovely evening. Till next time. Bye.